we should go ahead and start. Cool. Thanks for showing up, folks. As I was saying, this is our first webinar for the Building Leaders of Color initiative. My name is Andrew Spieldenner, Andy, most people call me. I'm the chair of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, and what we're trying to do here, we were charged with doing something on Robert's Rules of Orders, and I really think, as somebody who's living with HIV as a person of color, as somebody who's been doing this work, I entered the work as a young person years ago. I think it's important that we think about not just Robert's Rules of Orders, but really how we walk into a space. And what kinds of, how do we know what the rules are of the spaces that we walk into? So some of it may seem a little remedial for some people, and for some people, it's just a good reminder of being deliberate when we walk into a space. So can we advance the slide? So this is being recorded, and people will be able to use it at their leisure, or see it at their leisure. Some rules: mute your computer. I definitely prefer calling into webinars for better audio. Use the chat box, it's up, I'm seeing it, I'm looking at it now. We'll open it, I'll have questions that I hope people participate. Otherwise it'll just be me talking to Yami, which we've done before. So can you advance the slide? Cool. So as you know, because you've all been through the training, Building Leaders of Color, oops, back one. Can you go back one? So Building Leaders of Color is a leadership training initiative focused on people of color living with HIV. What we wanted to do, we recognized that we had very limited time, but we had folks in person, and we thought that was really important to stack up all the skills that we wanted. But we also wanted to do some online modules that are meant to kind of complement what you got in person. So this is the first one. Next slide. So the theoretical background, in my day job, I'm a professor, so I always like to think about why, or think about, or read other people that have thought about why. So Edward Hall wrote about how people use space and how things are culturally specific, and he got that way by working for the State Department. He was working for the State Department trying to figure out why sometimes people got along and why sometimes people couldn't. And so he traveled all over the country looking at how United States government people interacted with the local communities. And he realized a few things: that we take certain rules for granted, all cultures do, about how we use space, how we communicate with each other, how we even consider time. So one of the things that he realized is that when you violate rules, people will sometimes ignore you or not pay attention to you. And he found everything from, like, a lot of Americans don't appreciate back channel talk. I grew up in a family where everybody talked at the same time. Many of us do. And then we get into a room, people are like, we're only talking one at a time. And that doesn't really make sense to us. And I tell my students, I'm like, I don't really care if you talk, because I'm used to being in that environment. And I think that there's weird formality for, like, turn taking. But I recognize that for some people, it's very important. So here we've got a picture of a subway station in Japan. And this is actually how they're used to getting on trains. They've got two people that shove everyone into the train to make sure there's enough people, make sure that there's enough, that everyone's using up space. So imagine being in lines like that. Most of us would turn around and say, why are you touching me? So that's one example. Next slide. So Audre Lorde, Black lesbian feminist poet, she wrote a lot about how trauma shapes the way that we walk into a space. She wrote about the experience of racism, sexism, and homophobia, and as well as a woman living with cancer. And so one of the things that she said was that, and I have the quote there, when we are afraid, having a hard time reading everything. When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. And I think, that for me changed a lot of the way that I understood my space and understood how I wanted to engage people. I realized that my voice is sometimes the only thing I have. So the other thing that she taught us was that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, which meant that the way that we engage people, we should be conscious of the ways in which we have been oppressed, so that we don't inflict that harm upon others. Next slide. Dietrich Spivak gave us the idea of the subaltern, which is this idea that some people don't have a voice. They're not allowed a voice in society. And I think, she's written about a caste system. She's writing about a caste system in India, but I think in our society, in America, we can see the same thing, that some of our communities are so marginalized, some of our constituents, that they don't have a voice in that space. And sometimes it's our responsibility to bring that voice forward or to hold it up when somebody talks from that space. So whether it's around homelessness, drug use, people's trans experience, people who've been in prison, these are people who, these are communities that we need to uphold their voices in HIV and really center our talks around. Here I've got a picture of Cesar Chavez because he was really good at being able to speak to everyday people. He led a labor rights movement with migrant workers in Florida, in California. And he really understood that, we could sit in academia and talk about labor rights, but we need to actually go out to the farms and organize people and get people to understand their rights. And so I think he's a good example of somebody who understood the power of language in education and using kind of everyday language to get people radicalized around their rights. Next slide. So here we've got the great Maxine Waters. What did Maxine Waters mean when she was saying reclaiming my time, reclaiming my time? Who was she talking to? Does anyone? Should we unmute? Can we unmute people?
I think Maxine Waters was really talking about African-American people reclaiming their time.
That's great, Marissa.
This particular speech, because I think I did watch this particular speech. I think she was really talking about those that were minorities. So it was African Americans, and it was specifically, I think, a conversation around women.
So she's actually, thanks, Marissa. That's great. Because what's important about this is it's become such a larger moment than just what happens, right?
Right.
We all hear. I mean, she changed our dialogue nationally just by doing this.
Right.
And all she really did was she was telling somebody who was bullshitting her that they couldn't use her time anymore to bullshit her.
Right. Exactly.
It was a congressional investigation. It was a Senate panel, and she was like, she asked a question, and the guy, instead of answering her, said, "I really respect all the work you do." And she was like, "That's not what my question was." And then the guy kept on bullshitting her, and then she just said, reclaiming my time, because you only have a set amount of time to talk. And she was like, "I'm a black woman here. You can't do this. You're not. Right. You can't waste my time." And so what's amazing is that she was using the rules. She used the rules in that meeting against this guy.
Exactly.
But it's become this really huge idea that we get to reclaim our time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Next slide. So basically, when you walk into a room, any place you walk into a room, there's going to be cultures involved. Here we've got, a twink walking into a leather bar, but really it shows you kind of how there are definite rules for formality, informality, how we use space, how we dress, how do we want to be seen and understood. So the example that I generally use because a lot of people, when they walk into advocacy rooms, they think about being authentic or, being real. And it's like, sometimes there's a difference between, being disingenuous, about who you are, but also like understanding the space you're walking into. So I always use the example of like church. Do you really give the same presentation at church that you would around your friends or around a group of people at the bar? Probably not. because most of our churches have different rules of formality. And so if we want to engage the space in a productive way, we have to figure out what's going on. So in this particular space, I probably would not have walked into a leather bar wearing a bow tie, a vest, and those particular jeans. I probably would wear something a little closer to what everyone else is wearing. Next slide. So one of the things to keep in mind when you walk into a space is that the larger the space is, generally the more formal the rules are. And as you get to know people, then you start to relax about the rules. But basically when you walk into a room, people try to use a more civil tone if it's a larger room. And I personally, I understand that civility is pretty problematic, the idea that politeness. I'm not a particularly polite person. So when I'm in rooms, I try to mitigate that. I try to tone it somewhat down, but I'm still pretty assertive. You know, keep in mind that no one uses completely formal language. Don't be put off if people are using really formal language. You know, nobody really does it. And when you participate, you know, when you first start participating in these rooms, generally, you know, use a more formal tone if you want to be heard. But again, I really want to stress that there's no wrong or right way to communicate. It's just about what you want out of the space and what kinds of messages you want people to hear. Next slide. So with that, I always think that we start with goals. What are your intended outcomes when you walk into a space? You know, generally when I have to go to a formal meeting, I ask other people what do they want out of the meeting? You know, how do people want to be represented? I just gave a talk at an annual convention of 130 grant makers for HIV. And the first thing I did when I found out that I had to give the talk was I talked with the other people that were on the panel with me, but then we hosted a conference call of 10 organizations to get their feedback of what they wanted us to talk about. Because it was really a good opportunity, but also I didn't feel comfortable walking into the room with just, this is what Andy thinks. I wanted to really be able to say, you know, I talked to 10 organizations and this is what we wanted out of this meeting. And then we were able to kind of guide our talk based on those outcomes that we wanted. We wanted very specific things from these funders. And so we strategized, how do we get to that outcome? How do we get them to fund in the areas that we think are important without explicitly telling them, like, just give us money. And so we kind of created these narratives to help us. And we strategized around who the allies were in the room based on which grant-making organizations fund. In this particular case, we wanted to stress the importance of networks of people living with HIV. And so we actually highlighted some of the funds that have gone to that to get allies in the room. But I think you always have allies in the room, and you always have people that aren't quite your allies. And sometimes they look like us, and sometimes they don't. So you know, sometimes the person that's most likely to throw you under the bus looks an awful lot like you. Sorry. And sometimes our strongest allies are the people that we don't expect. And I think it's important that when you see people who are allies, to meet with them, touch base with them, ask them questions. Next slide. So I'm not naive, and I don't think any of us are. We all know that when we walk into some spaces, we're not welcome. There's often clear signs that we're not welcome. You know, and sometimes it's in language, and sometimes it's the way that people interact. For a long time, I felt like people saw me as a community voice, and they didn't pay attention to me because they were like, oh, that's that community kid talking. And I thought I was imagining things, but I look back and I really wasn't. You know, people would comment like, oh, you're cute, when I would talk, and I'd be like, but did you hear what I said? And, you know, that's just a way, it's a microaggression. You know, people will often tell women or gay men that they're cute or pretty, but not necessarily listen to us. It's a way of saying like, oh, you know, oh, aren't, you know, whatever you said doesn't matter because it's all about how cute you are. And that's really appropriate in a bar, but
Trans
not a
women
meeting.
get that a lot. Like, they get that a lot. You've heard me talk about that, Andy. Yeah.
The first time I met Tiami, she was coming from an airport. She was in a car with two people she did not know yet. And one of them said to her, "Aren't you pretty? You can pass." And she lit into them for how problematic that construction was. And so by the time they got out of the taxi into our meeting, they had been schooled about how problematic it was when they meet a trans person. Like, "Oh, you can pass. Aren't you pretty?" Which was wild and fun and a great way to meet you. But yeah, so these are microaggressions, and people use microaggressions all the time. It's casual degradation. It's both verbal and nonverbal. Sometimes people think they'll say things like, "Oh, well, they're loud," or "Oh, they're passionate about what they say." They don't say like, "Oh, they're smart," or "They were right," but they'll say like, "Oh, they were passionate." Often, as people living with HIV, as people of color living with HIV, we're generally relegated to the community voice, and it's all about us trying to figure out how to make that work for us. So even if we are relegated to the community voice, that means we still have a voice. Generally when you go into meetings, there's like 10 people that work for the government and you. But you're the voice that matters the most, because those 10 people working for the government are all going to say whatever the government says. And these are examples on the side of different microaggressions that you get in everyday life. So "That's so ghetto" is a microaggression. It's a way of telling people that they're not valid or that they belong someplace else. We see a lot of microaggressions right now aimed at immigrants, and they're actually macroaggressions at this point. And I think that, oftentimes one of the weird microaggressions you get when you don't look American is, whatever that means, is, "Oh, your English is so good," which I find really odd, but people will say that all the time. Or "Where are you from?" Because you can't be from here. Next slide. So I think what's important when we talk about identity and experiences, and this slide it comes out of a lot of conversations I've had, particularly with white people, about how they feel like their experiences aren't recognized when we talk about racism, or we talk about sexism, or we talk about homophobia or transphobia. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that identity is socially determined and constructed. So we don't necessarily have a choice in how we get identified. We don't have that choice, whereas experiences are the things we share about ourselves. So sometimes we share that we were substance users, or sometimes we share that we were sex workers, but it's not something people assume necessarily when we walk through the door. Whereas I think, and I think people have a hard time with that idea, that they feel like, "Oh, well, I was poor once," and it's like, well, some of us still are. And so it's being able to help them or realize that their experiences, whatever they may be, are valuable, but they're different from our identities. So when we walk in the room, we're a person of color living with HIV. That we don't have a choice about, and that means certain things in this country. Whereas, people have the option to say what their degrees are in, or where they went to school, or how they grew up, or how many kids they have. Sorry, I don't know about y'all. I get tired of that conversation. "Oh, my kids." Thanks. I mean, it's an important conversation for people to have them, but for those of us who don't and choose not to, it's a little, it feels a little like I'm not part of the crowd. But I think that, these are things that we can talk about, that, our identities and our experiences are a little different. Next slide. So this was originally started out as a Robert's Rules of Order webinar, and it grew into something different, but we are going to talk about Robert's Rules of Order slightly, because they are used by almost every advisory council or government group. They use some version of Robert's Rules of Orders. Usually it's an adapted version, a modified version. One of the things to remember about Robert's Rules of Order is that it started as a way to get every voice heard. And so people may use it to silence people or to ostracize them, but really it started as a way to make sure every single voice in the room was heard before a group decision could be made. I put some links there to some online websites that have a lot more information about it, because I'm going to give you some highlights to some of the key parts of Robert's Rules, but really, you know, you can look at it, look at those free resources. Next slide. So Robert's Rules are a set of processes. So one of the key things to keep in mind is there are only very specific times that you can raise questions or concerns. And at other points, it's not available for that. You know, you're not supposed to raise questions or concerns. One thing to keep in mind is that a quorum, when they say quorum, it's the minimum number of members needed to conduct business. So oftentimes people will, it's one way of getting some stuff done is by reducing the quorum so that fewer people have to be involved. And the trick there is to make sure that however your group decides that a quorum exists, is it a half? Is it 51%? Is it 25%? Just keep in mind that how often do you and your allies get to go to the meeting? And how many are you going to have to miss? So when can they conduct business without you is a key thing to keep in mind. Using Robert's Rules of Order, all agenda items have a specific time. Some are action items, and you need to know which ones those are, which means that a decision has to be made, and some are informational. So we go into meetings, and sometimes they're just telling us things, and we don't have to make a decision or vote. And so sometimes if it's informational, we can ask questions of clarification, but there's not really much to refute there or reject. When we have action items, though, there is a time for discussion after the motion is heard and seconded. So after a motion has been recognized and somebody seconds it, then you can ask questions, not before. So wait for a motion to be made. And sometimes I second things sometimes just to fight about it, because you can't fight about it until someone seconds it. So that's just a strategic thing. Next slide. There's 3 basic motions in Robert's Rules of Order. The first is the main motion, which kind of focuses discussion on a business item. It's people move things. That's how they say it. I move, blah, 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 blah. I make a motion. People then have room for amendment. And sometimes you'll hear friendly amendments, and some are not so friendly amendments. But basically, the idea is that you adjust part of the main motion. So maybe it is about, you know, how many things get bought or how things are going to be granted, funded. You know, they'll make a motion about like focusing on outreach or testing or linkage to care, and you want to kind of amend it. So maybe you want to include a certain number of trans organizations or a certain number of people of color groups in that. And then there's amend the amendment. Those are just 3 basic motions. So if you hear it, you know, that's how you would change something slightly. So if somebody has a main motion that you're against or that you want to modify slightly because you don't think that there's enough diversity. Generally, I obviously amend things for diversity because I feel like most people have motions that don't have any race or gender specific language in it. And I like to amend it because I don't think we'll get seen otherwise. I think a lot of times the same organizations get funding, same organizations have power because we don't require diversity. Next slide. One thing to keep in mind, raise your hand to speak. The chair takes note of who and then recognizes you to speak. So that's not about, you know, that's just the formalities of it. Always state your name and affiliation before you speak. Some of these meetings are recorded, but the other element of it is that people need to know your name, and they need to know that you are present and part of the conversation. So I always say my name and affiliation, even if they already know it. Always talk to the motion at hand. Don't bring up something else. If you think it's important enough, you should have added it at the beginning of the agenda. So when there's other items, make sure you add anything that you think is important. And also don't repeat other people's points. That's redundant, and also it gets annoying. We've all been in meetings where somebody says, oh, I agree. I want to say the same thing and. It's like, okay, they've already said it. It's done. Don't revisit it. Next slide. So this goes back to quorum. So if you disagree, I put up there the review agreement that none of us read and all of us sign for apps. You know, we don't actually know what we're agreeing to. I never read them. I don't know if anybody really does, but there are things that people agree to, and one of the ways in which you disagree, figure out how much of the group needs to agree to get a motion passed. So if it's a simple majority, some use 2/3 votes, which is harder, but some use simple majorities. If you disagree with something and you can't find a way to kill it, bunt it to the next meeting. So just postpone it. Just say, you know, I table this for I think we should table this for the next meeting to get more information. And also one of the things that's hard for people, you know, just talking with some other PLHIV folks doing organizing, and it's like we're able to get people in the room, but sometimes people don't know how to use their voice. And I think it's important to practice saying no. A lot of us have a hard time saying no publicly. And I think it's, you can either vote nay or abstain. Sometimes I abstain from a vote when I'm not comfortable agreeing. And it's important to be able to do that. So if you don't agree with it, say nay or abstain. If you believe that it affects your constituency in a negative way, definitely say no. Next slide. So this, it's interesting, you know, I'm a communication professor, and I always tell people to practice communicating. We do have particular ways of communicating always, and I think some people spend a little more time thinking about how they're communicating than others. But I think it's important to practice. Practice how you talk, how you get, you know, what are you asking for? Practice saying no. I think it's important to ask people for feedback, whether they can handle it or not. Whether you can handle it is a separate issue. I think we've all been in trainings where we think, this person probably doesn't realize that they come off a certain way. Or we've been in trainings where we're like, that didn't quite land right. And I don't think a lot of people are good at getting feedback, but when you're trying to communicate, try to get feedback from people you trust. You know, did I come across a certain way? Did I sound a little harsh? My thing is I'm afraid I sound stupid. Every time I give a talk, I'm like, am I sounding like an idiot? So I always ask people, like, was that bad? Did I sound dumb? But keep that in mind. We code switch constantly, and code switching is a good thing to learn. You know, we talk differently depending on who the target is. So, you know, we talk differently with our families and with our romantic partners, or some random person at the store. We should talk differently, right? And so we call that code switching. Next slide. Think of it. Questions? Anybody? Marissa, Michael, Johnny? Said through that. So keep on doing what you're doing. Keep on doing block work. That's my contact info. Nobody has any questions.
Can you hear me, Andy?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Well, when we get into these Robert's rules, it always comes down to that there's always the stickler who is sitting there with a booklet ready to read off the rule to you, and it seems as if it's a distraction. Is there a way to politely tell someone that's a distraction, that you're holding me to such a standard that I can't function because I'm not remembering every single set of rules?
Great question, Michael. And I've seen that happen a lot in meetings. Basically, I would make it a function of the group to discuss it. I think, you know, you put it on the agenda for the chair that you want to discuss a modified version of Robert's Rule, or just and just modify it so that it's not such a, you know, wait, this rule here. You know, because that's a way of silencing, and it's okay to make that part of the discussion with the chair. Just say, I feel silenced in the room because of this, and put in an agenda item that you want to modify rule, because the person doing that is called a parliamentarian, and they're supposed to keep people by the rules. But if it's not working for the group, that's when you say this doesn't work.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it starts with a meeting with the chair and then making it an agenda item so the group can modify it. Because the parliamentarian is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's just annoying.
Very annoying.
It is annoying, and and I don't think they understand that they're really stifling the way that people can participate.
Okay.
Cool. Any other questions, concerns?
I don't. Thank you, Andy. Thank you. Like it wasn't boring. Like I stayed engaged. And when I thought of Robert's Rules of Order, I was like, oh God, really? Because I've sat in church meetings where that's where they followed Robert's Rules of Order, and I literally like wanted to like just convert to Satanism, you know, right there in their face, something. But yeah, it was horrible. But like that was just because of like the environment, right? So having never been like sitting officially on a planning council, but being in community advisory board, like I understand the relevance. So thank you.
Sure. You know, when they told us they wanted a Robert's Rules of Order, I just couldn't. I fell asleep when they asked for it.
Okay.
Like, they can't.
Right.
So I really wanted to focus more on kind of understanding the culture of rooms and trying to get your point across in them, and give some basic rules about communication, you know, formal and informal communication, all that. And also, like, don't feel bad if you use informal communication and everyone's formal. You know, it's you know, you deserve the space too. It's your space also.
Right.
I think that's important.
You know, just remembering like being at the regional training, one point that Linda wanted to stress to the participants was that, you know, you may go in there as a, you know, representing a demographic, but there are times when you are just literally yourself asking questions, right? And remember that you have that right to ask questions for all points of clarification, because how can you be a better advocate if you're unclear on, you know, what is being said or how things operate?
And sometimes that's a great point. Sometimes the point of clarification, you can actually ask, how does this affect substance users? How does this affect sex workers? How does this affect people of color in the community? Mm-hmm. And if they can't answer it, that's a good reason to table it until they can.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of these groups pass rules but don't think about, like, oh, that affects sex workers or substance users very differently than it affects, like, you know, kids in high school, you know.
Right.
And I think, and I use that as an example because you see these groups that focus on young people all the time, and they focus on in-school youth. And I'm always like, they're already in-school youth. Like,
yeah.
Why don't we center it someplace else?
Yeah, that was going on years ago when I was in school. Like, it hasn't stopped. So
yeah. And that's why it's always like, well, that's nice. We're going to get them anyway. So why don't we focus on another group? And if there's limited funds, why are we resourcing people that are already resourced? Versus like, I don't see very many planning councils or very many groups really taking on like centering people who've been in prison or centering people who use drugs or centering sex workers or centering trans folks. You know, and only a few center people of color. I mean, if we talked about racial justice in planning councils, it'd be a very different conversation than what we're getting. So, cool. Any other comments? Oh, I have a question about the recording. Are our faces going to be included in the recording? Does it record the video also?
Yes, it does. Aren't you happy you shaved?
I love you guys. I gotta go to the next meeting. Love you guys.
Bye, Marissa.
Love you too.
Love you.
So, I think we're done.
Yeah. Michael, just so you know, it is being recorded, and I will actually, once it's finished, I will drop it into the Google group. So everyone who didn't have a chance to actually be on the webinar will be caught up to speed and have the opportunity and share the slide deck.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, you guys enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.